I walked through my front door, expecting the smell of Margaret's pot roast and the sound of her humming along to the oldies station. Instead, I heard a sound that made every hair on the back of my neck stand up. It was my wife, sobbing so hard she couldn't breathe, curled up on the living room floor with her reading glasses cracked beside her. My daughter-in-law was standing over her, arms crossed, tapping her foot like she was waiting for a bus. My son was sitting on the couch scrolling through his phone like nothing was happening. When they saw me, the whole energy shifted. My daughter-in-law rushed over and grabbed my arm. "Dad, thank God you're back early." She had another episode. We just came by to bring her some soup and she started throwing things and screaming about burglars. She knocked the lamp off the table and almost hit David. She pointed at the shattered ceramic lamp on the hardwood floor. I looked at my wife. Margaret wasn't staring at the wall or at some invisible threat. She was staring directly at my daughter-in-law, Rachel, and her eyes were full of terror. My name is Walter Braddock. I spent 34 years as a criminal defense investigator for the Commonwealth of Virginia. Before that, I did 2 tours in military intelligence. I have sat across the table from men who killed for money and women who poisoned for insurance payouts. I have read crime scenes the way most people read the morning paper. And right now, standing in my own living room in Loudoun County, every alarm bell I had was going off at once. I knelt beside Margaret. She flinched when I reached for her. That flinch told me everything. Margaret had survived a minor heart attack 8 months ago, and it left her tired and occasionally forgetful. But she was not violent. She had never raised her hand to anyone in 43 years of marriage. I looked at the broken lamp. The shards were scattered outward from the center of the room, not against the wall where they would be if she had thrown it. Someone had smashed it straight down onto the floor. Then I saw it. Margaret's sleeve had ridden up past her wrist, and there on the inside of her forearm were 4 small bruises, perfectly spaced apart. Fingermarks. Someone had grabbed her hard enough to leave a print. I made a decision in that moment. If I said anything now, they would deny it. They would claim she fell. They would say I was confused. I had to be the Walter Braddock who used to sit in deposition rooms and let guilty men talk until they buried themselves. I stood up slowly, letting my shoulders sag. "Maybe you're right," I said, keeping my voice low and tired. "She's been getting worse. Let me just get her settled down. Can you 2 give me a minute?" My son David finally looked up from his phone. "Sure, Pop. Take your time." We left some groceries in the kitchen. Rachel patted my shoulder with a hand that felt like a dead fish. "We're just worried about her, Dad. That's all." They left, and I waited until I heard David's truck pull out of the gravel driveway before I moved. Before I tell you what I found on those cameras and how I used a broken coffee mug and a stack of fake documents to dismantle the people who tried to destroy my family, let me know where you're listening from in the comments below. Hit that subscribe button if you believe that when your own blood betrays you, the only justice that matters is the kind that hurts their wallets. I spent the next hour getting Margaret into bed. She wouldn't speak. She just held my hands so tight I thought she might crack a knuckle. Once she was asleep, I went down to my study and locked the door. 2 weeks earlier, I had noticed Margaret's heart medication was running out faster than it should. I figured the pharmacy shorted us, or maybe the cleaning lady knocked a bottle over. Just to be safe, I had installed a small wireless camera inside the smoke detector in the living room. High definition, wide angle, with audio. Old habits. From the intelligence days, I logged into the feed and scrolled back 4 hours. I clicked play. The footage loaded in sharp detail. Rachel and David walked in through the front door using the spare key I had given them for emergencies. They didn't have soup. They had a manila folder full of documents. Margaret was sitting in her chair reading a mystery novel. She looked peaceful. She looked healthy. Rachel snatched the book out of her hands and slammed the folder on the coffee table. "Sign these, Margaret. We don't have time to wait for Walter." Margaret looked confused. "Sign what? I can't sign anything without Walter. He handles all the finances." David stood up from the couch and started pacing. His face was red. "Mom, Rachel and I are in trouble. Real trouble. I owe some people $400,000, and they're not the kind of people who send polite reminders. If I don't pay by the end of the month, bad things are going to happen. You need to sign the trust over to us right now." Margaret stood up. "I'm not signing anything. You need to leave." That was when Rachel stepped forward and slapped my wife across the face. The crack of it came through my laptop speakers so clear, I felt it in my own jaw. Margaret stumbled backward. David grabbed the ceramic lamp from the side table and smashed it onto the floor next to her feet. Shards flew everywhere. "Sign the papers, old woman," Rachel hissed, leaning into Margaret's face. "Or maybe next time you fall down those basement stairs. Walter's not here to protect you." Nobody is. I watched my wife of 43 years sobbing on the floor while my son and his wife stood over her like vultures, waiting for a carcass to stop twitching. The video ended, with them hearing my car in the driveway. The transformation was instant. Rachel smoothed her hair. David kicked the folder under the couch. They rearranged their faces to lie to me. I sat in the dark for a long time. I copied the footage onto 3 separate encrypted drives. I uploaded it to a secure cloud server I still maintained from my consulting days. I made sure that video existed in places they could never reach. I could have called the sheriff right then. I had enough for assault and elder abuse charges, but I knew how that would play out. They would claim it was a one-time emotional outburst. Rachel would cry in court and say she was under pressure. David would get a public defender who would plead it down to probation. And worst of all, they would still think they were smarter than me. No. I wanted to hit them where it actually mattered. I wanted to dismantle them financially, legally, and personally. I wanted them to watch everything they valued turn to ash. The next morning I brewed coffee and waited. At 8 sharp, the front door opened. David and Rachel let themselves in with that spare key. They walked into the kitchen radiating nervous energy. "Morning, Pop," David said too loudly. "How's Mom doing?" "Resting," I said, turning my back to pour coffee. I barely slept. Kept thinking about what you said about her getting worse. I sat down heavily at the table and rubbed my forehead. "You might be right. I can't handle this alone. But the problem is money. If we need to get her into a care facility, we're looking at $10,000, $12,000 a month. My pension won't cover that." I let the silence sit for a moment. I'd have to liquidate some assets. I've got a portfolio of stocks and real estate holdings worth about $3.5 million. I was saving it for you two, actually. But I guess I'll have to sell it off. The air left the room. I saw David's eyes go wide. Rachel gripped the edge of the table so hard her knuckles turned white. "Dad," Rachel said, her voice carefully controlled, "you don't need to go through all that stress. If you give us power of attorney, we can manage the whole thing. We'll make sure Mom gets the best care and protect the rest from taxes." David pulled out a document. It was the same form they had tried to force Margaret to sign yesterday. The name at the top had been changed to Walter Braddock. A general power of attorney, granting them complete control of every account, every property, every investment I had built over a lifetime. I reached for my reading glasses. I picked up a pen. I saw Rachel hold her breath. David was practically vibrating. I brought the pen to the paper. Then I reached for my sachet, the mug with my other hand, and let my arm jerk in a convincing tremor. The mug tipped. Hot coffee flooded across the table, soaking the document until the ink ran and the paper turned to brown mush. "Oh Lord," I said, fumbling with a napkin. "Look at me. I'm so clumsy." David cursed under his breath. Rachel's face went tight with fury before she forced it into a smile. "It's fine, Dad. We'll print another one." "You know what?" I said. "Let me have my attorney, Jim Hartwell, look this over first, just to make sure we're doing it right for taxes." The mention of Hartwell, my old war buddy turned estate lawyer, made David flinch. "We don't need a lawyer, Pop. That's just more money. If I'm signing over $3.5 million, I said firmly, I want it done properly. We can meet next week." David looked like he had swallowed a wasp, but he couldn't push harder without blowing his cover. They left, and I watched from the window as David kicked my mailbox on the way to his truck. Good. Angry people make mistakes. That afternoon, I drove to the county clerk's office and pulled every public record associated with David's business. Then I went to the bank where I had co-signed a small business loan for him 3 years ago. The branch manager, a woman named Patton who I had known for years, pulled up the account records when I showed her my guarantor paperwork. What I found made my stomach turn. The business account had no legitimate expenses, no payroll, no inventory purchases, no operating costs. Instead, there were dozens of wire transfers to an offshore entity in the Bahamas. I recognized the pattern immediately. It was an unlicensed online gambling operation disguised as a consulting fee. David had burned through $280,000 of the business loan chasing losses. But that wasn't the worst part. The credit report showed collection activity from a firm in New Jersey that I knew by reputation. They were the friendly face of a syndicate that did not send second notices. They sent men with baseball bats. The total debt with penalties and interest was just over $400,000. Then I checked Rachel's supplemental card on the business account. $65,000 in 1 year. Luxury boutiques, spa weekends, cosmetic procedures, a $3,000 handbag. She was funding her lifestyle with money stolen from a loan that had my name on it. I also discovered something else while I was at the bank. A withdrawal request had been flagged that morning at the branch across town. $50,000. Cash. Authorized by a countercheck bearing my signature. Except I hadn't signed anything. I looked at the digital scan. The forgery was good, but not good enough. After an identity theft scare 5 years ago, I had started adding a tiny crosshatch inside the tail of the letter K in Braddock, invisible to the naked eye. The forged signature didn't have it. I told Patton to flag the check for manual review and stall the withdrawal. I wanted David standing at that counter sweating, thinking the money was coming, and then walking out empty-handed. I drove home with a plan solidifying in my mind. If David didn't get that cash, he would come for the only other liquid asset he knew about. The fireproof safe in my study where I kept emergency cash and the deed to our property. And when he came for it, I would be ready. But when I pulled into the driveway, something was wrong. The house was too quiet. I walked inside calling for Margaret. No answer. Her chair in the sunroom was empty. Her knitting basket was overturned. The half-finished crossword on the table was crumpled, like someone had been pulled away from it. On the kitchen counter was a note in David's handwriting. Mom had a violent episode. For her safety, we called emergency services. She's been admitted to Ridgeview Behavioral Health for a 72-hour evaluation. If you want to see her, bring the signed power of attorney and the property deed to Rachel's office tomorrow at 9. Don't bring lawyers. My blood went cold. They had taken her. They had used the symptoms from the day before. The confusion she showed after I now realized they had been tampering with her medication to convince a doctor to sign an involuntary commitment order. I checked the security camera footage. I saw the ambulance pull up. I saw David meet the paramedics on the porch, wringing his hands, pointing inside. I switched to the interior camera. Margaret was sitting in her chair working on her crossword. She looked up, expecting me. Instead, she saw strangers. David pointed at her and shouted, "She has scissors." She threatened to stab my wife. Margaret was holding a pencil. She held it up, confused. "No. I'm doing my puzzle." The paramedics moved in. One of them grabbed her arm. She screamed, "Walter! Walter! Help me!" I watched my wife being strapped to a gurney while she cried out my name. I watched David standing in the corner with his arms folded, nodding along as he signed the transport papers. I watched them wheel her out of our home. I put the phone down. A sound came out of me that I didn't recognize. It started low and rose into something raw and primal. It was the sound of a man who had spent his entire life inside the system, realizing that the system had just been weaponized against the person he loved most. I went to the bathroom and splashed cold water on my face. I gripped the sink until the porcelain creaked. Then I picked up the phone and called Jim Hartwell. "Jim, they took Margaret. She's at Ridgeview on a bogus hold. I need you to activate everything we discussed. Emergency injunction, fraud affidavit, the whole package." And call Mike Brennan at the state attorney's office. Tell him I'm cashing in that favor from the Holloway case. Then I made a second call to a man named Stokes who I had worked with during my military intelligence days. Stokes was retired now, but he still had contacts at every level of law enforcement in the mid-Atlantic. Stokes, I need federal eyes on this. Wire fraud, elder abuse, possibly kidnapping. My son-in-law forged my signature on a bank check today, and my wife is being held against her will in a psychiatric facility on falsified paperwork. Stokes was quiet for a moment. How fast do you need it? Yesterday, I said. That night I didn't sleep. I sat at my desk and built the case file the way I had built hundreds of case files in my career. Bank statements, showing the gambling losses, wire transfer records to the offshore shell, the forged check, the security camera footage of the assault, the footage of Margaret being dragged away screaming. I organized it chronologically, cross-referenced every document, and burned it onto 4 separate drives. At 3 in the morning, I also did something I had been dreading. I checked Margaret's medication. I opened her weekly pill organizer and held one of the tablets up to the light. Her cardiologist prescribed metoprolol, stamped with the code M32. The pill in my hand was stamped differently. It was alprazolam, a high-dose sedative. In a woman with her heart condition, this dosage could cause confusion, slurred speech, motor control failure. It would look exactly like dementia. They weren't waiting for her to decline. They were manufacturing the decline. They were poisoning my wife to build a medical case for incompetency. I replaced every pill in the organizer with her real medication from my travel kit. I sealed the swapped pills in a plastic bag and labeled it with the date and time. Chain of custody. This was no longer a family dispute. This was attempted murder. The next morning at 9, I walked into the commercial real estate office Rachel used as her base of operations. I dressed in my oldest cardigan, the one with the moth holes. I carried a cane I didn't need. I shuffled through the door looking every bit the defeated old man they expected to see. The conference room was set up like a tribunal. Rachel sat at the head of the table in a blazer that probably cost more than my monthly grocery bill. David sat to her right, leg bouncing, sweat on his upper lip. Beside them was a man named Lowell, an attorney I recognized from the county bar as someone who had been censured twice for ethics violations. And in the corner, a large man in a tight sport coat who was introduced as Mr. Dane, a business associate. I knew what he was. He was the collection agent. He was there to make sure the money moved before David's deadline expired. Rachel slid a thick document across the table. We've prepared the transfer of assets, Dad. Full power of attorney, authorization to sell the Loudoun County property, and access to the trust. It's all standard. I looked at the stack of papers. I let my hand tremble as I touched the edge. Where is she? I whispered. I need to know she's okay. She's resting, David said quickly. The doctors say she's stabilized. She's in good hands. I want to see her. David pulled out his phone and dialed. A moment later, he turned the screen toward me. I caught a glimpse of Margaret lying in a hospital bed, eyes closed, looking pale and small. He pulled the phone away before I could look closely. See? She's fine. Now sign the papers, Pop. Let's get this done. I pulled out my pen. An old silver fountain pen Margaret had given me for our 30th anniversary. I uncapped it slowly. I looked at Rachel. I looked at David. I looked at the man in the corner checking his watch. I placed the nib on the signature line. I want you to know, I said, my voice suddenly losing its tremor, losing the weakness, losing the act, that you are about to get exactly what you've earned. David laughed nervously. Yeah, Pop. Just sign it, I wrote on the paper. But I didn't write Walter Braddock. In clear block letters, I wrote, Title 18 USC 1343, Wire Fraud. I capped the pen. The click echoed off the walls. David grabbed the paper. He stared at it. His brain refused to process what his eyes were seeing. What the hell is this? Read it out loud, I said. standing up straight and kicking the cane across the room. "That's not my signature, David. That's the federal statute you violated when you wired $280,000 of a co-signed loan to an illegal gambling operation in the Bahamas." I pulled out my phone and pressed a button. The flat-screen monitor on the conference room wall flickered to life. I had accessed their office network that morning and loaded my files onto it. The screen showed the security camera footage from our living room. Rachel slapping Margaret. David smashing the lamp. The audio was crystal clear. Rachel's hand flew to her mouth. David went white. Mr. Dane in the corner stood up slowly. "You told me this was a simple family transaction," he said to David, his voice flat and dangerous. "You didn't tell me you were beating up old ladies. I don't need this kind of exposure." I pressed the button again. The footage changed to the hospital camera feed that Stokes had obtained through a federal warrant filed at 4 that morning. Margaret restrained to a bed, an orderly tightening the straps while she winced in pain, her mouth moving, forming my name over and over. Then I reached into my jacket and pulled out a stack of photographs. I tossed them onto the table. They fanned out perfectly. They were photos of David at a restaurant in Arlington 2 days ago with a woman who was not Rachel. Holding hands, kissing, paying the bill with the business credit card that had my name on it. The same afternoon, Rachel was at the pharmacy picking up the sedatives she used to poison my wife. Rachel picked up a photo. Her hands were shaking so badly, the paper rattled. She recognized the woman. She recognized the handbag the woman was carrying, the same designer bag Rachel had wanted, but David told her they couldn't afford. "David," she whispered. "Who is this?" David stammered. "That's a client. Pop is lying. He's trying to turn us against each other." Rachel looked at the photo. Then she looked at the footage of her mother-in-law tied to a hospital bed. Then she looked at her husband. Something inside her broke. She launched herself across the table and raked her nails down David's face. He screamed and tried to shove her off. They crashed to the floor, knocking over chairs. I walked to the window and pulled back the blinds. Down on the street, a convoy of black SUVs and unmarked sedans had pulled up to the building. Red and blue lights flashed silently against the glass of the neighboring offices. I turned back to the room. I'd suggest everyone stay exactly where they are. The door burst open. Federal agents in tactical gear flooded the room. "FBI, get on the ground. Hands where we can see them. Mr." Dane was tackled before he could reach the door. Lowell, the lawyer, was handcuffed against the wall, already calculating his plea deal. David and Rachel were pulled apart and cuffed separately, both of them bleeding and screaming. I stood in the center of the chaos, untouched. An agent approached me. "Mr. Braddock, we have a team at Ridgeview right now. Your wife is being transferred to Inova Fairfax. She's safe." Safe. I let out a breath I felt like I had been holding for a week. They dragged David past me. He looked up, his face streaked with blood and tears. "Pop, please. I can fix this. I'll pay you back. I swear." I looked down at him. I remembered the day he was born. I remembered teaching him to ride a bike in the driveway of this same county. I remembered the day he asked me to co-sign that first business loan and swore on his mother's life he would make it work. "You can't pay me back, David," I said, "because you're bankrupt. Not just financially. You're morally bankrupt. And I'm done subsidizing your debt." I turned to the agent. "Take him." Then they brought Rachel past me. She looked at me with ruined mascara and wild eyes. "Dad, help me. I have a daughter. Emma is only 6. You can't do this." I looked at her. "You should have thought about Emma before you drugged her grandmother." The courtroom 3 months later smelled like floor polish and regret. I sat in the front row. The seat beside me was empty. Margaret wanted to come, but I wouldn't let her. She was getting stronger every day, but I would not let them see the damage they had caused. David came in first. Prison had stripped the arrogance off him like paint thinner. He was thin. His head was shaved. He wouldn't look at the gallery. Rachel came next. Without the makeup and the designer clothes. She looked like a stranger. When she saw me, her face crumpled and she mouthed something I couldn't hear. The evidence was overwhelming. The wire transfers, the forged signature, the security footage, the toxicology report confirming the medication switch. Lowell had already turned state's witness, testifying against all of them in exchange for a reduced sentence. When the time came for the victim impact statement, David's public defender stood up first. "Your Honor, my client's 6-year-old daughter Emma needs her parents. We ask for leniency on those grounds." David stood and held up a crumpled photo of Emma. "Dad, please," he said, his voice breaking. "Don't punish Emma for what I did. Write a letter to the judge. Tell them you forgive me. She needs her father." The courtroom went silent. The judge looked at me. "Mr. Braddock, as the primary victim, you have the right to address the court." I stood up and walked to the podium. My legs felt heavy, but my spine was iron. "I loved you, David," I said, looking directly at my son. "When you were born, I made 2 promises. The first was to protect you. The second was to protect your mother. You forced me to choose between those promises, and I will choose your mother every single time." David's face fell. "You asked me to think of Emma," I continued. "I am thinking of her. I'm thinking that if I let her be raised by parents who would drug an old woman and forge a man's signature to steal his life savings, I'm sentencing that child to become exactly what you became. The kindest thing I can do for my granddaughter is make sure she learns that actions have consequences, even when those actions come from people who share your blood." I turned to the judge. "Your Honor, my wife still wakes up screaming in the middle of the night. She still flinches when someone reaches for her arm. She spent 3 days strapped to a bed in a psychiatric ward because her own son told paramedics she was dangerous. Tolerance for that kind of evil is not mercy. It's permission to do it again." I sat down. The judge sentenced David to 12 years for wire fraud, money laundering, and aggravated elder abuse. Rachel received 7 years for conspiracy, kidnapping, and fraud. The gavel came down with a sound that shook the room. I watched the marshals lead them away. David screamed my name. Rachel collapsed and had to be carried. I watched until the heavy doors closed behind them. I walked out of the courthouse into bright afternoon sunshine. My phone buzzed. It was Jim Hartwell. "Walter, the family court judge signed the emergency custody order this morning. Emma is officially in your and Margaret's care. The social worker will bring her to your house this evening." I stood on the courthouse steps and let the sun warm my face. I had lost a son, but I had saved my wife, and I had gained a granddaughter who would never know the cruelty of the people who created her. Not if I had anything to say about it. That evening, Margaret and I stood on the front porch of our cottage by the lake. A silver sedan pulled into the driveway. A social worker stepped out, and then opened the back door. Emma climbed out, clutching a stuffed rabbit and a small pink backpack. She looked up at our house with wide, uncertain eyes. Margaret walked down the steps. She knelt on the gravel, bad knees and all, and opened her arms. "Hi, sweetheart," she said softly. "I'm your grandma, Margaret. You're going to stay with us for a while. We have a garden out back with tomatoes and a cat named Biscuit who sleeps on the porch." Emma looked at Margaret. Then she looked at the stuffed rabbit. Then she walked forward and buried her face in Margaret's shoulder. I watched from the porch, leaning against the railing. The sun was going down over the lake. The sky was turning gold and purple. Margaret looked up at me over Emma's head and smiled. It was a real smile. The first real smile I had seen from her in months. 6 months later, our life is smaller. Our dinner table has 3 chairs instead of the 6 it used to have. We don't answer the collect calls from the federal penitentiary. We don't open the letters with the prison stamp. Some people might think that's cold. They might say a father's love should be unconditional, but those people have never watched their own child sign paperwork to have their mother committed to a psychiatric ward on lies. I've learned something in these 71 years. Family is not the name on your birth certificate. Family is the people who hold your hand when the doctor gives you bad news. Family is the people who show up at 3 in the morning when you're scared. Family is not biology, it's behavior. Emma is learning to read. She sits on Margaret's lap in the sunroom every afternoon and sounds out the words in picture books. She calls me Pop Pop, and she calls Margaret Nana. She doesn't ask about her parents much anymore. When she does, we tell her the truth in the gentlest way we know how. They made some bad choices, sweetheart. They're in a place where they're learning to make better ones. Last Tuesday, Emma brought home a drawing from school. It was 3 stick figures standing in front of a house with a big yellow sun overhead. She pointed at the tallest figure. That's Pop Pop. She pointed at the middle one. That's Nana. She pointed at the smallest one. That's me. She looked up at me with those big brown eyes. I drew our family. I put that drawing on the refrigerator with a magnet. It's still there. I'm Walter Braddock. I'm 71 years old. I lost a son, but I saved my wife. I lost a fortune in legal fees, but I bought my freedom. And I gained a granddaughter who is teaching me that the best chapter of a man's life doesn't have to be the first one. If you're out there right now holding on to someone who is hurting you just because they share your last name, I want you to hear this. Love is not a suicide pact. You are allowed to protect yourself. You are allowed to walk away. You are allowed to choose peace over loyalty to people who would set your house on fire and then blame you for the smoke. Thank you for listening to my story. Let me know in the comments what you would have done in my situation. Would you have forgiven them? Or would you have done what I did? And if you have someone in your life who loves you the way Margaret loves me, go tell them right now. Don't wait. Life is too short and too precious to waste on people who see you as nothing more than a bank account with a heartbeat. Like and subscribe for more stories. Take care of yourselves. And remember, protect the ones who truly love you. Goodbye.